Recently, I got into a somewhat vehement disagreement with my sister. This was unusual because we typically agree. I was remembering a family gathering from a while back, and from her perspective, she thought I was viewing the past with rose-colored glasses. She went out of her way to tell me that I had not enjoyed the time I was describing nearly as much as I now remembered it. She felt I wasn't doing myself any favors by pretending it had been better than it was, and she thought I was actually setting myself up for future disappointment as a result. This was somewhat of an ironic change of roles because typically, as the older sister, I'm the one providing the important corrective lens to a past memory. Later, we had a good conversation to unpack the conversation. She owned that for her, she tends to gloss over the pain of her past, and that it's been important for her to sometimes really remember how bad things were as part of her own healing. I was able to share that I was trying to figure out what the future might hold. And so looking at the past with a positive light actually helped that become a reality for me. All of this reminded me, though, that if there's one thing neuroscience is getting clearer and clearer about all the time, it's that our memories are not very reliable. The Hidden Brain podcast recounts this interesting study. 20 years ago, researchers found that showing people false pictures actually changed their childhood memories. They created photos for the volunteers in the study showing them participating in a hot air balloon ride. They then asked the volunteers to recall everything that they remembered about the photo and had them rate how confidently they felt about those memories. Half of the people who were questioned created complete or partial false memories of these balloon rides that never happened. In fact, when it was revealed that the photo was a fake, one study volunteer said, "That's amazing, because I honestly started to think I had done that." A more recent study aimed to replicate these findings and swapped out the balloon ride with a ride on a Viking ship. The results were similar. 40% of the people reported false memories. The participants who reported false memories had details and coherent memory narratives attached to the Viking ship that were not even in the doctored photographs. We tend to think of our memories as a handy little file cabinet that we can just reach back into and pull out the relevant folder. But the reality is each time our brains remember, the memory is changed in the act of the remembering. If this is true, then clearly our memories must have a different purpose merely than recounting our history with factual accuracy. In our worship and our faith tradition, we acknowledge our tendency to forget, which is partly why when we gather at the table each week, we remember our common faith story. But we are not merely reaching back to the Last Supper. We are connecting ourselves in this moment to that memory and all the times the people of God have gathered together to proclaim our shared story. Sometimes in the present, we have to forget one way of being to remember a more foundational call to be people of faith and hope. What do you need to forget so that you can remember? The people in our reading from Isaiah this morning have a lot of forgetting to do before they can really remember God's vision for them. Some of them have returned from exile in Babylon to find the ruins of what they thought they remembered. Those who remained behind have had some experiences the exiles will never understand. It is easy to imagine this fragile and divided community getting caught in their own narratives, unable to move forward, lacking empathy for one another, distrusting their leaders, and getting trapped in their own cynicism, born out of past experiences. But into that space, the prophet Isaiah enters, and he invites a sort of holy forgetting so we can remember the dream of God. Isaiah says, "For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy and its people as a delight." The prophet then goes on to affirm the suffering they have endured by promising that those things will not return. All children can have a bright future. There is economic prosperity available for all, and our needs will be met before we even realize them. It may be tempting when we hear these visionary acclamations of the prophets to imagine them as some pie-in-the-sky fantasy. But the posture of faith is one that sees hope despite the suffering. Theologian Abraham Heschel famously said, "The prophets carry the emotions of God to us so we can know God's heart more intimately." It is the calling to greater perspective that has the potential to save us from our flattened and cynical view of reality, particularly in times when we feel buffeted by suffering all around us. We must have voices that call us to remember the deeper truths we may have forgotten. The prophets paint a picture for us so that we can start to believe in and create the future that God sees for us. Once we catch that vision anew, we see what is before us very differently, because the present has become transformed by hope. We suddenly see a lion and a lamb together, not as foe and food, but companions along the way. That new creation is based on abundance rather than scarcity. The new creation sees one another all as beloved children of God. There are no enemies or people to be feared. Empathy and compassion grows when we already know ourselves to be safe and cared for by our loving God. When we find ourselves lacking empathy for others, what might it look like to step back and deal with our own fear first? I suspect when we take that moment to reflect, we often find we have forgotten what spurred our attack on the other. God's vision of hope and generosity for us may feel impractical, if not downright reckless. And yet over and over again, we find that when we offer more than we think we can, we are rewarded. We are moved outside of ourselves and find ourselves in service to the one who is the giver of all good gifts. I suspect many of us are not unlike the people of Isaiah. We may identify with those exiles who are just returning from Babylon. We may wonder what the future can hold in these times. We may feel overwhelmed by the size of the task and resent people who weren't there when we were suffering. That remnant who is suspicious of those who we feel went away. We may imagine that others have no capacity to ever really know what we are going through. But the prophet calls us to forget all that would divide us and remember our deep connectedness. We are the people of God, and we are called to scale the walls of our own cynicism and fear once again, to place our trust in the God who promises a very different creation, one of hope and abundance, or where, as our gospel reminds us, not a hair of our heads will perish, and through our endurance, we gain our souls. Amen.
Amen.